In the autumn of 1887, the Gallatin Valley spread south and west from Bozeman in long golden tiers of dry grass and pine-shadowed foothills, a country that forgave nothing and gave back only what a person wrested from it by hand. The ranches there were old enough to have buried their founders, and young enough that the paperwork of ownership was still unsettled, still argued at county seats, still carried in coat pockets rather than held in proper ledgers behind glass. The Homestead Act of 1862 had promised a quarter section of federal ground to any citizen who could live on it, improve it, and prove up on it after 5 years of documented cultivation. Thousands of people in the territories had done exactly that, and their patents were real and their rights were real. But the documents that represented those rights were pieces of paper kept in county offices that flooded and burned. The chain of title from the land office to the homesteader to the next holder was only as strong as its weakest recorded link. A woman who understood land documents understood something most of the valley's residents preferred not to look at too carefully. Property in that country existed in 2 registers simultaneously. The first was the physical register of fences and crops and cattle worked through winter, and the second was the paper register of patents and entries in deed books kept in a brick office on the main street of Bozeman. The valley trusted only the first register. Werner Voss had taught his daughter to trust them both. Barnrn Voss was 26 years old when her uncle told her to leave. She had lived on the Voss place since she was 9, brought there by her father in the spring of 1870 after her mother died crossing the Yellowstone. She had arrived thin and confused, and still wearing her mother's small hand-stitched shawl over her dress, and her father had settled her on the wagon seat beside him and driven the last 12 miles to the ranch without speaking. He had made her a bed in the loft room. He had fed her. He had brought her a kitten the following week from a neighbor's barn, a gray one with white feet, and said nothing about it, only set it down on the kitchen floor and gone back to work. She had grown up pulling fence wire, hauling feed, doctoring cattle in January mud, and learning from her father the particular art of reading a survey chain and a legal description until the words translated into actual ground, actual corners, actual feet. Werner had not taught her these things as curriculum. He had taught them by including her. She sat beside him at the kitchen table when he read his patent certificate for the first time and watched him move his finger along the legal description matching the words to his knowledge of the ground he had walked for 7 years. She walked the property corners with him in 1875 when he restaked the survey irons that had shifted in frost heave. She copied entries from the deed book for him in 1876 when his hands were bandaged from a barbed wire cut. By the time she was 16, she could read a meets and bounds description and draw the parcel it described with reasonable accuracy. By the time she was 20, she could identify the section and range from the legal description alone, without reference to a plat map. Her father, Werner Voss, had taught her that the land did not lie. The man who held the paper might lie. The land itself held still and waited for someone to measure it correctly. He had said this to her for the first time when she was 10 years old, and he was walking the east boundary line with her beside him, the gunner's chain stretched between its 2 handles, in the dry October grass. He explained what a chain measured, 66 feet, and why the system worked, and how a section of land divided into its parts, and how a legal description told you where to start and what direction to walk and how far. He was patient with her questions and precise in his answers. He did not simplify things to the point where they became inaccurate. He simplified them only to the point where a child's mind could follow the logic and build from there. By the time she was 12, she understood what a meets and bounds description was and why it was different from a rectangular survey, and why the Gallatin Valley used one and other parts of the territory used the other. By the time she was 14, she could set a surveyor's compass and run a line. He had given her this knowledge the way he gave her everything, not as a gift with ceremony attached to it, but as a tool placed in her hands, without comment, with the expectation that she would know what it was for. Werner died in March of 1886 of a chest ailment that had been quieting him since the previous fall. He died in the ranch house he had built with his own hands in 1871, on ground he had claimed by homestead patent and improved by 16 years of continuous, documented labor. He died without a proper will because he was 51 years old and believed there was time. He died trusting that his brother Court, who had arrived from Wisconsin in 1879 and who had worked alongside him since, would act as a man of his word. Court had been useful in those years. He was a willing worker when there was enough to be done to occupy him, and Werner had been glad of the help, glad to have family on the place. He had never examined whether Court's willingness was gratitude or calculation, because Werner Voss was a man who trusted quietly and did not revise that trust without cause. Court Voss was not a man of his word. He was a man who had watched his brother build something of value and had spent 7 years calculating how to keep it. In the months after Werner's death, Court produced a bill of sale, dated September of 1885, by which Werner had supposedly sold him the ranch and all its improvements for the sum of $400. He did not produce this document immediately. He waited 4 months, until the winter had passed, and Barnrn had organized the spring cattle work and begun to consider what changes she might make to the grazing rotation. Then he put the document on the kitchen table one evening and told her the ranch had been his since before her father died, and she had been living there on his sufferance, and that his sufferance had come to its end. The document was notarized by a clerk in Bozeman, who was later discovered to have notarized documents he had not witnessed, and who had since departed the territory. Barnrn did not have the money to challenge it in court. She did not have a lawyer. She had the inherited habit of reading things carefully, and when she read the bill of sale, she recognized 3 errors in the legal description of the property, errors no man who had lived and worked on those acres for 16 years would have made. The section number was 1 digit from the correct value, the range was transposed, and the creek, named as the eastern boundary, was not the creek that ran along the Voss place. It was a drainage 3 miles to the south, on a different parcel entirely. The bill of sale described ground that was not the Voss ranch at all. It described some other set of acres, a section of land that Werner Voss had never set foot on. She said so to Court calmly, pointing to the discrepancies with her finger. He told her the ranch was his, and she had 2 weeks. She did not argue past that point. She recognized that argument was not the instrument the situation required. What was required was documentation, and documentation took time and a county records office and a calm hand, none of which were available to her in that kitchen. She left with the satchel, the clothes on her back, her father's survey tools in their worn leather case, and $22 she had saved from the sale of a calf the previous autumn. She was not weeping. She was thinking about the errors in the legal description, and about something her father had said to her once, in the barn on an afternoon when the light came low through the gaps in the siding and lay across the hay in long yellow bars. "If you ever need to know who truly owns a thing," he had told her, "read what was recorded first, not what was recorded last. First." She had been 15 then. She had not fully understood. If you have ever watched someone lose the place they were raised onto a piece of paper, leave a word below. There are more stories like this one than the records show. And stay close, because what Barnrn found in that barn is why this story is still told in the Gallatin Valley today. She took a room at a boarding house in Bozeman, kept by a widow named Ruth, who charged 30 cents a night and asked no question. Ruth was small and white-haired and had been keeping that house for 11 years. She had seen people arrive from the valley with nothing enough times that she had stopped constructing explanations for it. She gave Barnrn the room at the back that overlooked the kitchen garden and left a pot of coffee on the stove in the mornings. The room contained a narrow iron bed, a washstand, a single chair, and a hook on the wall for a coat. Barnrn set her satchel under the bed and her father's survey case on the chair and sat for a while in the thin afternoon light coming through the window, not weeping, not disordered, doing what her father had taught her to do when confronted with a problem that had no fast solution. She thought it through from the beginning carefully and in order, without skipping the steps that were uncomfortable to examine. Barnrn spent 3 days at the county recorder's office, working through the land records for the parcel her father had homesteaded. The recorder's office smelled of dust and old paper, and the particular dry warmth of a room heated by a small iron stove. The deed books were tall and heavy, their spines lettered in faded gilt, and the clerk who kept them was a young man named Sims who wore wire spectacles and who seemed genuinely uncertain what to make of a woman in a traveling coat asking to examine the original homestead entries from 1871. He brought her the books she asked for without objecting. He brought her a second book when she asked for it. He did not offer assistance, but he did not obstruct her, and by the afternoon of the second day he had begun to set the relevant volumes on the counter before she reached the shelf herself. What she found first was the original homestead entry, filed by Werner Voss in June of 1871, describing the parcel in a precise chain-and-link survey description that placed the southeast corner at a particular iron stake and ran from there north by northwest along the creek drainage for 160 acres. She copied it by hand in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, transcribing the section and range and every meet and bounds clause. Then she found the patent certificate issued by the General Land Office in 1878, after Werner had fulfilled the 5-year cultivation and improvement requirements. The patent described the same parcel in language that matched the original entry nearly word for word, with the Land Office's seal and the Commissioner's signature and the date of issuance in a clear hand. Then she read Court's bill of sale again, the document he had shown her before she left. 3 errors. She wrote them in a column beside the patent description, matching each wrong clause against the correct one. The section number was wrong by 1 digit. The range was transposed east and west. And creek described as the eastern boundary was the Soldier Creek drainage, which lay 3 miles south of the Voss place and formed the boundary of an entirely different parcel owned by a man named Aldrich, who had bought it from the Territorial Land Office in 1880. The bill of sale did not describe the Voss Ranch. It described someone else's ground. She sat with that for a long moment in the pale light of the records room, her finger on the page, her breathing even. The clerk at the front desk was shuffling papers. A horse went past outside on the street. She wrote the discrepancies into her notebook in a careful column, each entry dated and attributed to its source document. She cross-referenced the patent certificate line by line against the bill of sale. She noted the divergence in the compressed, economical handwriting her father had taught her to use for field notes, where space was limited and accuracy was everything. She did not yet know whether Court had made the errors deliberately or whether the forged document had been prepared by someone who did not know the land well enough to copy its legal description accurately. It did not matter which. The errors were there. They were documented. They could be proven by any person who set the 2 documents side by side. What she needed now was the original deed. The bill of sale court had produced was dated 1885. If Werner had not signed such a document, and Barnrn was as certain of that as she was certain of anything, then there had been no valid transfer of title. The ranch remained in Werner's name. As his only surviving heir, it passed to her by the ordinary operation of descent. But inheritance, without a recorded document, was assertion, and assertion needed corroboration. The patent itself was the foundational document, registered with the General Land Office in Washington at the federal level, beyond court's reach. What he could have tampered with were the local records, the county deed book, and any instruments recorded there. She checked the county deed book for any transfer recorded in Werner's name between 1871 and his death in March of 1886. She read every entry for that period, running her finger down the index, checking each page number. She found none. The property had never been conveyed. It sat in the record, in Werner Voss's name, with no notation of sale, no deed of transfer, no encumbrance beyond a small chattel mortgage on the cattle that had been paid off in 1883. Court had not recorded the bill of sale in the county deed book. He had only shown it to her and used its existence to push her off the land, relying on the fact that she had no money for a lawyer and no obvious means of resistance. She closed the deed book and returned it to the clerk. She thanked him. She walked out into the October air of Bozeman and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, with her eyes on the mountains to the south, blue and already dusted at their peaks with early snow. The case against her uncle was documentary. It was precise. She had the original patent, the recorded homestead entry, and the deed book's silence, where a transfer should have been. What she did not yet have was the thing her father had told her about once and never shown her, the document he had said he kept, because he did not trust that the record alone was proof enough of what was his. Werner Voss had kept a copy of the original homestead entry and the patent certificate, signed and sealed by the land office, wrapped in oilcloth, buried in a tobacco tin in the northeast corner of the barn floor. He had told her that once. She had been 12. She had half listened, the way a 12-year-old half listens to a thing that seems to belong entirely to the adult world, a precaution against a danger she could not yet imagine. He had said that a lockbox can be taken, a floor cannot. She had not thought of it in 14 years. She thought of it now with the clarity of a woman who had spent 3 days in a records room confirming that her father had been right to be careful. She visited a lawyer named Harlan Price, who had an office above the hardware store, and who listened to her for 40 minutes with his hands folded on his desk. He was a spare, gray-haired man who had practiced in Bozeman for 12 years, and who had seen enough homestead disputes that he did not require the situation explained twice. He asked clear questions and wrote the answers on a notepad in a neat, abbreviated hand. He told her she had a case, but that proving the bill of sale fraudulent would require either expert testimony on the notary's history or the original documents in Werner's name, which she had said were buried in the barn. He said if she could retrieve those documents and bring them to him unaltered, he believed the county court would hear the matter favorably. He said the bill of sale's errors in the legal description were significant, and that a court would take notice of them, because no legitimate transaction in that valley was conducted with a description that named the wrong section and the wrong creek. He charged her $5 for the consultation. She paid it. She had $17 left. She also visited a woman named Clara Bent, who had worked as a cook on the Voss place in the early years, and who now lived on the western edge of town with her husband and their 3 grown sons. Clara was 61, wide-shouldered, and had known Werner Voss since before Barnrn was born. She had been at the ranch in the spring of 1871 when the foundation of the house was being laid, had fed the work crew breakfast on a plank table set in the open air before the walls were up, and had followed the progress of the place through the years that followed with the proprietary interest of someone who had been present at its beginning. She listened to everything Barnrn told her, without interrupting, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her expression changing only slightly at the part about the bill of sale. Then she said quietly and without particular inflection that she did not believe Werner had signed any such thing, and that she would say so under oath if asked. Then she said, "Your father's neighbor Rolk still runs cattle on the section east. He was at the place last spring for the branding and saw your uncle turn you out. He said at the time it was not right." Barnrn knew Jed Rolk. He was 70 and had been neighboring with the Voss place since before Court arrived from Wisconsin. His land abutted the Voss east fence for nearly a mile, and he had shared a branding crew with Werner every spring for 15 years, and had borrowed Werner's bull one summer when his own went lame. He was one of those men who said very little and held his opinions close, but whose opinions, when they surfaced, were generally accurate. She rode out to Rourke's the following morning, borrowing Clara's mare for the half-day's trip. Rourke was in his yard mending a gate when she arrived, his breath clouding in the cold air, his hands moving carefully on the iron hinge. He looked at her for a long moment when she rode in before he said anything. Then he said, "I heard Court showed everybody some paper. I did not believe that paper. Your father never sold that place. He would not have sold it for $400 or $4,000. She told him what she had found at the recorder's office, taking him through the discrepancies, the legal description, without rushing it, because she wanted him to understand not just the conclusion, but the method of arriving at it. He listened with the attentiveness of a man who had spent a lifetime reading ground, and who understood that the difference between one section and the adjacent one, between one creek and another 3 miles south, was not a small difference. When she was done, he nodded once and said, "The section number is wrong by 1 digit, and the wrong creek. That would be the Aldrich ground south of here." She told him about the tobacco tin in the barn floor. She told him she needed to go back to the ranch to retrieve it, and that she needed a witness to her retrieval, and that she would understand if he did not want any part of Court's temper. Rourke set his gig down and looked at her steadily. He said, "I am 70 years old, and I have been a neighbor to that place for 16 years. I will come." They went to the ranch on a gray morning in the second week of October, Barnrn on Clara's mare and Rourke on his own horse, arriving before dawn when Court was still inside the house and the valley was dark and cold under a sky heavy with clouds that had come in overnight from the northwest. The barn sat 80 yards from the house, to the north and slightly downhill, screened by a stand of cottonwoods that Werner had planted as windbreak, when the trees were saplings and that had grown tall and gray-barked in the years since. Barnrn went to the barn first, alone. She carried a short-handled spade from Rourke's saddlebag and a lantern. Rourke stayed with the horses at the cottonwood screen, watching the house. The barn smelled of old hay and cattle, and the particular cold that gathers in a structure through the long stretch from September to November, a settled cold that belongs to the building rather than to the air outside. She stood inside the door for a moment and let her eyes adjust, the lantern low, its light touching the nearest stall post and the hay on the floor and nothing beyond the northeast corner. She walked to it. The floor was packed dirt, overlaid with straw, and a thin coating of decades of dust and debris. Her father had built this barn in 1874, 3 years after he proved up on the house. He had been working on it in the summers. She was 12 and 13, and she had carried boards for him and held posts plumb while he nailed the top plate and done the 100 small tasks that barn building required of whoever was nearby. The smell of it, old hay and cold and the mineral trace of packed earth, was as familiar to her as any smell she knew. She crouched in the northeast corner and set the lantern down and began to probe the dirt with the spade handle, pressing it in at intervals, looking for the give of disturbed ground or the resistance of a buried tin. She found it on the third probe, 18 inches from the corner wall, 8 inches down. The spade handle struck something solid and produced a faint hollow resonance. She set the handle aside and used her hands, scraping away the packed dirt carefully, brushing rather than scooping so that she disturbed as little as possible, until she felt the lid of a tin under her fingertips. Its edge raised slightly above the surrounding soil. The lid was sealed with a strip of cloth and wax that had hardened over the years into something closer to resin, adhering to both surfaces so that the seal had held against moisture and the freeze-thaw of many winters. She worked the lid free with her thumbnail and the edge of her pocket knife, going carefully along the joint. The lid came away with a short resistance and then released. The tin itself was painted once in a color that had faded to no particular color at all in the darkness underground. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had held its integrity, were 3 documents. The first was a handwritten copy of the original homestead entry, in Werner's own hand, with the correct section, range, and legal description written out in the careful block printing he used for anything important. Every clause was present and correctly transcribed, the creek named correctly, the section and range correct, the iron corner stake described with the same precision as the original entry in the county record. Yet made this copy she could see from the original document. The handwriting was deliberate and unhurried, the lettering of a man who was transcribing something he intended to last. The second was a certified copy of the patent certificate, bearing the Land Office's embossed stamp and the signature of the General Land Office Commissioner in Washington, dated July of 1878. It was a true copy, certified by the issuing office, and it carried the same force as the original. The third was a short letter, also in Werner's hand, addressed to no one in particular, stating that he had buried these copies because he did not trust that a single record in a county office was sufficient proof of what a man had earned by labor, and that if anyone was reading this letter, it meant the records had been questioned, and that Werner Voss had homesteaded and proved up on this land lawfully, and intended it to pass to his daughter Barnrn upon his death. He had written a letter she could see, not in a moment of fear, but in a moment of clear-eyed practicality, the way a man checks a fence line in the fall, not because he expects trouble, but because trouble does not announce itself. The letter was dated the spring of 1880. She had been 14. He had buried it when she was 14 and said nothing to her about it until she was 15, and then only once, casually, as though he were mentioning where he kept the spare lamp oil. She sat in the dirt of the northeast corner of her father's barn for a moment, with the 3 documents in her lap. The lantern put a circle of yellow light around her, and beyond that circle the barn was dark and cold and perfectly still. She read her father's letter twice. The handwriting was entirely his, the particular forward slant of the capital letters, the way he closed his lowercase s. She had grown up reading his handwriting on barn ledgers and cattle counts and the margin notes he made in the almanac. She recognized it with the certainty of a person who has read a hand for 20 years. She wrapped the documents back in their oilcloth and placed them in the inner pocket of her coat and stood. Outside she could hear Rourke's horse shifting its weight, the soft percussion of a hoof against frozen ground. The cottonwoods moved in a small wind. The house was still and dark. She went back to the horses and showed Rourke what she had found. He read the letter in the thin dawn light, holding it carefully by its edges, his lips moving slightly. When he was done, he folded it back carefully and handed it to her and said, "We will ride to Price's office this morning." They did. Harlan Price read every document in the set, taking his time, going back twice to compare the legal descriptions in Barnrn's handwritten copy and the certified patent copy against the bill of sale's erroneous language. He laid all three documents on his desk in a row and studied them with the focused patience of a man building an argument he intended to be airtight. At the end, he set the bill of sale aside and said, "This is not a difficult case. This is a clear case. The bill of sale describes land that is not the Voss parcel. The patent is registered with the General Land Office in Washington. The transfer was never recorded in the county deed book. Your father's letter establishes his intent and his foresight. He understood that a single county record was a single point of failure, and he took steps to provide a corroborating record outside the county's control. He was right to do it." Price said that the notary's history would be a separate matter for the county attorney. What concerned the civil proceeding was simpler. A conveyance that purported to transfer property, but that described a different property, transferred nothing. The Voss ranch had never been conveyed to Court Voss. It remained in Werner's estate, which passed by descent to Barnrn. He filed the petition to quiet title that same week and notified the county attorney's office of the circumstances surrounding the bill of sale and the departed notary. Court received notice of the proceeding by the third week of October. He hired a lawyer in Bozeman, a man named Fenner, who reviewed the documents and told him plainly that a bill of sale with the wrong section number and the wrong creek did not convey the Voss place, that the patent was a federal instrument he could not touch, and that the proper response to the situation was to vacate the premises and avoid a criminal referral if possible. Court contested the matter for 10 days before Fenner repeated the advice, and court accepted it. He left the Gallatin Valley in November of 1887. He did not leave word of his destination. The county attorney's inquiry into the notary's practices resulted in the invalidation of 11 other documents the man had certified. 2 of those cases involved similar disputes over ranch property. Both were resolved in favor of the rightful owners. The court issued its order quieting title in Barnrn Voss's name on the 23rd of December 1887, 2 days before Christmas. The clerk who entered the judgment in the deed book wrote her name in the careful copperplate script the county used for documents of record, and beside it wrote the section and range and legal description in the precise language of the original patent, the same language her father had written out by hand and sealed in oilcloth and buried 8 inches under the barn floor 7 years before anyone had need of it. She rode back to the ranch that afternoon with the title order in her coat. The sky had cleared and the mountains stood sharp to the south, white above the tree line and iron gray at their base, and the light that reached the valley floor was the flat, bright light of late December, without warmth, but without the obscuring clouds of the previous weeks. She put Clara's mare in the corral. Clara had lent the horse for as long as it was needed, and the loan was not yet fully returned. Clara came out from town the following week, and Barnrn returned the mare and kept her for dinner and told her the outcome. Clara sat with it quietly for a moment and then said, "Your father would have expected nothing else." She did not say it sentimentally. She said it as a statement of reasonable assessment, which it was. Barnrn walked to the barn that afternoon after Clara left and stood in the northeast corner. The tobacco tin was still there, open, the oilcloth folded beside it. She picked up the tin and held it. It was a plain thing, the kind of tin that had originally held tobacco or dry goods, purchased somewhere and repurposed for the task without ceremony. Werner had found it, had prepared it, had sealed the documents inside and wrapped them in oilcloth and buried it, and said nothing about it until he happened to mention it once, casually, when she was 15, as though the information might or might not be useful someday. She set the tobacco tin on the workbench along the west wall, the wall where the tools still hung in the order her father had last arranged them, the draw knife on its hook, the plane, the 2-pound hammer with a cracked hickory handle that he had wrapped with a strip of leather rather than replacing it, because it balanced perfectly, and a hammer that balanced perfectly was worth maintaining. She set the tin below the hammer and left it there. The barn was cold and smelled of old hay, and the stillness of a place that has been suspended and was now resumed. She went inside and built a fire in the cook stove. What she recovered that autumn was not only land, though the land was real, and the title to it mattered, and the cattle that would graze it in the years ahead were a concrete and necessary thing. She recovered proof of a way of working in the world that her father had practiced without naming it, the habit of understanding that the most important things must be recorded in more than one place, and that the person who controls the single record controls the truth. But the person who has made a true copy and put it beyond reach controls something the single record keeper cannot touch. Quote, Rark brought his cattle back across the east fence in the spring and worked with Barnrn through the first 3 calving seasons, lending his crew and his advice with the plain practicality of a man who had always considered the Voss place his responsibility by proximity, if not by ownership. He was old enough that the heavy work fell to his sons. But he was present, and his presence at the fence line and the branding fire was a form of testimony that the valley understood without it being stated. The women who ran the neighboring households brought food when she first returned, and a few of the men who had nodded at court on the street came around to do the same sort of reckoning with themselves and landed in different positions than they had occupied in November. The lawyer Price received the balance of his fee in the spring of 1888, paid in full from the proceeds of the first cattle sale under her name. She paid it in a single settlement in cash, without ceremony. He said he was glad the matter had resolved as it should. She thanked him for his work and did not elaborate on the gladness, because it seemed to her that things going as they should was not an occasion for gladness so much as a confirmation of what the process was for. The survey irons at the property corners held in place. She walked them in the spring of 1888 to confirm their positions, the way her father had walked them in 1875, carrying the chain and noting the readings in the same small notebook she had used at the recorder's office. The southeast corner iron was exactly where the patent description said it would be, set in the earth and undisturbed. The same iron Werner had driven there and the patent had named. The creek that formed the eastern boundary was the correct creek, the one that ran through the Voss place, not the Soldier Creek drainage, 3 miles south that someone had inserted into a bill of sale they had hoped she would not know how to read. She knew how to read it. She had been taught. She recorded the results of her corner walk in the small notebook and kept the notebook in the survey case with her father's instruments, and the survey case stayed on the shelf above the desk in the ranch house where it had always been. Each spring she walked the lines again. It was not a precaution born of distrust at that point. It was a habit, the practice of a woman who had learned that knowing exactly what you own is the prerequisite for defending it, and that the defense of it is never finished. The ranch ran cattle for another 43 years under her direction, and she ran it alone through most of those years, hiring seasonal help as the work demanded and managing the accounts with the same methodical attention she had brought to the deed books in the county recorder's office. She was not a wealthy woman by the standards of those who accumulated land through purchase and leverage. She was a woman who had held one piece of ground and worked it and kept accurate records of what she owned and what she owed, because her father had taught her that the record and the ground together constituted ownership, and that either one without the other was incomplete. The tobacco tin stayed on the workbench in the barn for the rest of her life, below the 2-pound hammer with the leather-wrapped handle. She did not rebury it. There was no need. What it had held had already done its work, and the proof it had preserved was now in the county record where it belonged, under her name, where her father had always intended it to land. The deed book entry was brief, as deed book entries are: a name, a legal description, a date, a reference number. She read it once when she received the certified copy from the clerk's office, running her finger along the section and range and the creek correctly named, the same way her father had run his finger along his patent certificate in 1878, matching the words to his knowledge of the ground he had walked. The language was correct in every particular. It was correct because her father had made a copy and put it somewhere a forged document could not reach it, and she had remembered where, and she had gone to get it. This is how the Gallatin Valley tells it, those who still know the story. A woman who could read a deed, a tin buried in a barn floor, and a father who understood that the only answer to a false paper was a true one, placed beyond the reach of anyone who might wish otherwise. If there is a document your family buried against the day it might be needed, think about what it would take to find it. Leave your thought below. There are more stories of quiet proof and patient labor on this channel, and the next one is worth your time. This story is a work of historical fiction inspired by the homesteading era of the American frontier. Legal proceedings, characters, and events are dramatized and do not represent specific real individuals or cases.